But if you were to put me in a Formula One car, most drivers, if you put them in a Formula One car, they think they'll keep up with Lewis Hamilton, you know? It's just like there's something culturally around that people just perceive themselves to be better drivers than they are.
Hello and welcome to the all-new podcast, The Auto Tech Show. My name's Mark Babin. It's great to have you with me for this all-new show. It's a good one. Thank you for being with us. On today's show, we're talking all about proven strategies for sustainable fleet operations, focusing on driver habits and fuel consumption. And to tackle this topic, I have the great honor to be speaking with Pete Rushmer. He is a fellow automotive podcaster with a show I highly recommend, Fleet Geeks, which focuses on a wide variety of fleet-related topics, as well as a second show, A Half Dozen Things, aiming more to support business owners and working professionals, or as Pete says, no fluff, no BS, and no self-proclaimed gurus talking about how easy business or life is, just real, raw, and frank conversations. He's also the founder and director of Flagship Partners, a consultancy and training service with a large footprint in the road transport sector, providing support to both large and small organizations as they advance in this rapidly changing industry. Quite the introduction there, Pete. Great to have you with me. Thank you so much for being with us and for making the time to have this show today. Really looking forward to our talk.
Appreciate it, Mark. I'm looking forward to having a chat with you, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's kind of weird having the introduction to the podcast played back to me. Made the old imposter jump up and down a little bit, going, "What's going on? What's going on?" This guy, he's listened to the podcast and enjoys it. That's good. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Mark, and to talk with you today. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed too, like obviously doing the research for the show today and looking into all the content that you produce on the show. It really is like we're really in a dynamic time in the industry right now, especially when we look at fleet. It's for you as well, and for me, it's really interesting to have these conversations just based on how dynamic it is. Are you finding that sort of exponential change just really enthralling in the content you produce?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like the fleet and transport sector, particularly in the UK, I know that you will be going out to other audiences, but certainly in the UK itself, it's a very interesting and dynamic time in the marketplace we're in. One of the challenges in the UK, and we're deemed to be very good from a fleet perspective and from a business driving for work perspective, but there's still this, 5 people every day lose their lives unnecessarily on the road. So there's so much work to do from a safety perspective. The national highways in the UK believe that 50% of all driving in the UK is for work. So people are driving for work. It's a business-related activity, and actually there's not that much governance. So the safety side is crucial, but we also have, like we're going to talk about today, the sustainability side, where you've got this like constant evolution because vehicles pollute the atmosphere. They're bad for our environment. So how do we minimise that? How all the alternative fuels, all the different options are out there, and it's just a really exciting time. The vehicles themselves technically are advancing at a fantastic rate. So yeah, it's a very varied and exciting industry. Even when there isn't so much development, but at the moment there's huge, and it takes a lot to keep on top of everything.
It does, and you put in the regulation side of it and the compliance and add that on top of all the technology and the solutions on the market. It all comes down to what we're talking today about these behaviors and how companies are meeting those sustainable goals. So really looking forward to it. And I wanted to start today's talk by looking at driver behavior regarding sustainability on the road. I strongly believe that no matter how many technology solutions or tools a provider and operator may have, it will always start with driver behaviors and habits of those on the road and those managing the fleet. So from that point, in your perspective, how much of an impact can driver behavior alone have on a fleet's holistic sustainability?
Sure. So, drivers of vehicles are absolutely vital, whether that's in road haulage sector, whichever sector you're in. Drivers and their behaviour have a huge impact on safety, sustainability, and the overall impact of a vehicle. And I've got a good story to share with you off the back of that, actually. When I used to work for a vehicle manufacturer, and they had a client who was an owner-driver of a truck, of an HGV, and this is one of the premium truck brands. And really interestingly, the driver was the owner, so he owned the vehicle and he drove it himself, and his fuel consumption figures were hugely, like, be off the chart in comparison to a normal fleet driver. But not only that, also his tyres, his brakes, from a maintenance perspective, I think it was something like the equivalent of like 60,000 kilometres before there was even a brake pad replaced, because the way he drove, you know. So if you imagine that kind of safety and driving with that much forethought and advanced thinking and reacting in plenty of time, so there isn't sudden acceleration, there isn't sudden braking, you know, those things have a big impact. If we look at just fuel itself, so most of the vehicles run on diesel, right? Now, I've got clients where, you know, they might be spending £40,000, £100,000 a week on fuel, and you start to, when you look at those very big numbers, so particularly on a fuel perspective, it's about 30% of the operating cost of an HGV, for example, or a truck. You know, we start to make incremental improvements around fuel consumption at even like 0.5%, 1%, or even as much as say 10%. That's some serious money that starts to flow through. That's a big benefit to the operator or the fleet owner themselves. So I think there's lots of different things that are important from a driver behavioural perspective. And then we look at, well, how do we influence the driver behaviour? Well, that's really important, because the driver habits are really the most important thing. So how are we incentivising drivers to reduce fuel, you know, how are we incentivising them to perform the best they can and reduce the cost of the replacement parts, for example, that it takes? Because as I've just proven, the best driven vehicles actually need far less maintenance as well, which is then good from a sustainability point of view, because we're not manufacturing more parts than we need, we're not throwing away more parts than we need, we're having less accidents, which involves having less, you know, obviously all panels. So I used to work in accident repair originally, so replacement panels, they have to be painted, you know, that has an impact. So all of those things, whilst that might not be good for business, for the vehicle manufacturers, it might be bad for their business, it's very much better for the environment. So absolutely, the user, the driver of any vehicle has such a big impact on sustainability and reducing unnecessary consumption of parts, fuel, tyres, you know, all of those kinds of things.
So if we look at then a lot of these actions, and it's obviously so important how the driver actually behaves on the road and the habits that they develop, like you mentioned, you can extremely prolong the length of that vehicle between services and get the best sustainability from that vehicle itself. The long-term fix and the long-term approach to having these things stick and have these habits stick, is it going to be a technology aid that helps that? Is it driver training programs? How does a fleet manager or an operation create that long-term success and movement towards more sustainable driving on the road from their drivers?
Yeah, sure. So I think the answer is all of the above. So all of the things you've said in as a short answer, and I'll just elaborate a bit more on that. So tech itself is really, really important. Let's make that a starting point, because it's a big focus for the show, right? So telematics are really, really important, because it enables you to analyse effectively the way drivers perform and behave. And it also enables you to data point that as well. So the struggle with any type of behaviour is seeing the outcome of what occurs off the back of the behaviour. But actually, I think it's really important for fleet operators to track accident rates, to track repair costs. And then what you can do is, with telematics, for example, it gives you so many data points for people's driving, harsh braking, acceleration, you know, speeding information, all of those kinds of things are all there available. So if we want to influence behaviour, it's around how we reward and then provide consequence for those behaviours. So rewarding the right stuff and consequences for the stuff that we're not looking for. So telematics plays a huge part in that, and it's so relevant, it's so live, it's right there. You know, if we've provided a certain route to a driver to follow, for example, through routing and planning, we've picked the most efficient route, we've picked the best one, it avoids the most obstacles, we're not going past schools, we're not going to hit any low bridges or something like that. If we select those, then through telematics, through trackers, we can just track to make sure that's followed. We need to, I think that the management of that is really important, to make sure that we really understand why drivers are behaving the way they do. So telematics is really important. You've then got things like training. So training is always important. We're big advocates for training. Certainly in my business, we deliver training for drivers in various different forms. And the thing that's important with that is that there's some level of accountability afterwards, because 80% of all training will just be forgotten within a week or 2 weeks if it's not then embedded. So we really think that it's important. We always promote that there's a management structure in place behind, and that's where things like the tech and telematics fall in, because it gives you those data points to demonstrate that the learning has occurred. So I always do recommend that. I also recommend that the manufacturers themselves, so all vehicles are different, so engage with manufacturers. How is this vehicle to be driven? What's special about it? The gearbox, how it revs, those kinds of things. What are the things we need to look out for? And what tools are available to the driver of that vehicle to enable them to be more sustainable in the way they drive. And I think putting things like competitive, putting a competitive edge on these things. So particularly, like I say, from a tech perspective, we can start to data point the drivers, and then we can create like a leaderboard and those kinds of things. So there's a bit of recognition for doing really well. And I think that can incentivise good behaviour, good driving behaviour that's sustainable and safe as well. That's the added benefit of that.
So it really seems like a delicate recipe of all these different elements coming together in order to have that long-term stickiness and success within those goals that you want to achieve sustainability-wise. In the conversations you're having, are drivers, because we know drivers, they're great at what they do. They drive the vehicles as best they can and in the most optimized way that they know how. Fleet managers and operators are giving technology and solutions, like you mentioned there with the telematics, to optimize routes and optimize efficiency and sustainable goals. Are drivers open to a lot of these new solutions and new ways that things can be done, maintenance habits, telematics with the driver tracking? Are they open to that, or are they kind of maybe stuck in an older way of thinking, I know what's best, leave me to it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, Mark. It's a really, really interesting question. And obviously from a culture perspective, I don't know much outside of the UK, right? But certainly in the UK, the average driving population of people who drive for work, particularly when we look at from a lorry driving, coach driving, a big vehicle driving perspective, most of those drivers are in their late 50s, okay? And driving seems to be, from a cultural thing, it's a little bit like, if how can I align this, right? So if I wanted to go and play football, right, and someone said to me, could you play with Messi or Ronaldo? I've got no chance of being able to keep up with Messi or Ronaldo from a football perspective, right? Or I've got to go and run 100 metres. Oh, I can't run 100 metres like Usain Bolt, okay? But if you were to put me in a Formula One car, most drivers, if you put them in a Formula One car, they think they'll keep up with Lewis Hamilton, It's just like there's something culturally around that people just perceive themselves to be better drivers than they are, I think. And that can be really tricky, right? That can be really tricky. And I know I kind of try and make fun of the thing, but it's kind of true, right? We go and we like pass a test very early on, and then we go and drive and we pick up loads of bad habits along the way. And don't get me wrong, drivers will become more competent over time, because naturally if you're doing something regularly, you practice and it becomes better. But the other thing that happens is bad habits come in too, right? So, and driving is like a solo task. So you're doing this thing like on your own, so you're not really getting any feedback or anything like that. So if I go and manage and lead a team of people, I'm going to have people who I'm reporting to that I'm going to get feedback from. I'm going to have an appraisal, they're going to tell me how I'm getting on, that kind of stuff. Well, the tech enables us, the tech is enabling us to be able to give feedback on that behaviour and be able to look at that. And then the training, like I say, all vehicles are different, they need to be driven in different ways. So making sure that we have that training from manufacturers, we get some guidance. We do things like SAFED. So in the UK, we have SAFED, which is safe and efficient driving. We do that training, we do that development, and then we just monitor it to make sure that the coaching occurs through, regular assessments and those kinds of things, and making sure. But the thing is that the data doesn't lie either, does it? Right? If one vehicle has got poorer fuel consumption and it's burning through more tyres, it's having its brakes replaced more readily. If we're starting to monitor that maintenance spend as well as a fleet manager, then all routes sort of indicate to the same thing. But one of the things we've not really spoken about, I suppose, is maintenance. That's really important too. But we'll come on to that.
Yeah, we'll get on to that.
Is that a good answer, Mark? Are you happy with that? Yeah.
I'm perfect. That's exactly it. I think it is a really delicate balance, and I think it's the goals of the organization are different than the goals of the driver. Traditionally, they have been in two separate rooms with the doors closed, and the drivers are very much, as I mentioned, they're experts in what they do. They are the Lewis Hamilton of their industry. They know how to drive their vehicles, how they see best. But once you get data involved and those suggestions start coming in, that question about how open are they to suggestion and feedback really comes into play when they've been on their own for so long. So I think it's really interesting how you answered that. And I think it is that everything coming together, and then that constant feedback loop, I think, is so important, right? Because you need the driver's input to know what's working. And like, you could have the best solution in the world and the drivers go like, listen, like, this is cool, we're not going to use it. Like, it's going to slow us down. It's going to make us more inefficient in this other way that maybe they didn't see. So having that feedback loop, I think, is super important.
And yeah, I think absolutely with behaviour. So behaviour is obviously really interesting, how we behave. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find, certainly as an employer myself, and having worked with many fleet operations, I always think that it's very difficult to introduce new schemes to existing team members. But once you have them introduced, it becomes less of a challenge when you bring people into an organisation, because they've not got the pre-programming, they've not got the pre-expectation. So when people come in and they go, well, this is how things are done around here, we really look at this stuff, we monitor it and those kinds of things, people are very accepting early on. So one of the things that I often come across as a pushback is the drivers will never accept it, they won't like it, right. It won't, that we're struggling to implement these changes. And I think one of the things is how that's communicated is really important. So how we communicate for organisationally as fleet managers with drivers is so important. We outline, this is why it's important. And you might perceive that historically all we ever cared about was getting the job done as quickly as possible, okay? Because if we get the job done as quickly as possible, then we get paid quicker, you get paid quicker, and we can get onto the next job quicker. But those objectives are changing now. More things are important. Safety, efficiency, sustainability, they're more important. So we need to just realign people with that, and we need to take drivers on the journey with us to understand, without there being a pun there is a pun there somewhere, but they take them on the journey with us around getting them to buy into the new ways of working. And that takes time with existing drivers, but less time with new drivers. And I think that's the thing to remember, is that if we set standards and set expectations, people who come in will just adopt those standards. So if that's the way it's always been done, and we clearly articulate it and we train them, and we take time to explain it and express why we're doing it. Because ultimately, for people to adopt a behaviour, they need to really just understand the purpose. What's the purpose of this? Why is it we're doing it? And then once they really, really get to grips with that, that normally helps buy-in as well. So I think I think it's important to add that the communication really helps drive behaviour too. It's really important to get that right.
I think that's a really important point to bring up, and I'm glad you did, because I think there's a lot happening that maybe the drivers aren't naturally aware of, right? There's regulation change that maybe operations is dealing with. There's other elements at play. And I think having that feedback loop, I think, is super important. I think that's an important point to bring up, and I'm glad you brought that communication point back up. Going back to the tech specific, obviously you mentioned the telematics, and the data analytics side is another element. When we looked at the route optimization as being one obvious element where this can help, are there other elements where you see these solutions, the data and the telematics, really playing an influential role?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the challenges is if we leave drivers to their own devices, for example, they'll naturally pick the thing that they think is best. Now, what the data tells us when it comes to from an optimization and analytics perspective, it's going to give us the right information that we need to be able to follow. So I think that the important thing is that the drivers they learn to follow that guidance, because actually the tech can make those decisions better than they can. Yeah. It knows more than they do, and it understands better.
Yeah, and I think it knows more, and then how it's able to also, we look at how smart these vehicles are getting and the tools that drivers are being given. It's no longer a pad of paper and a checklist. Maybe it's a software system where it's automated data capture, or the vehicle's collecting that information automatically on its wear, and we're seeing...
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I was fascinated the other day, because I always thought, just locally when I was driving, right, I take this journey, it's only about 15 miles, right? And I have a choice of like 2 or 3 routes. I've never put it into a sat-nav, for example, right? So, just from a sat-nav perspective, I've never put it into a sat-nav. I can't remember why I put it into a sat-nav. I think because it was like a stopping point on going further away, right? And I realised that I took a route just naturally, probably because it's the most interesting drive, right? It's like the nicest, right? I never realised, but I genuinely always thought it was the quickest route. Turned out it was taking me like 10 minutes more to drive this distance against something else. And Google, Maps is telling me something different. And I'm just scratching my head going, I can't believe that's quicker, and I've never even thought about that. And just using that as an example, we're talking about long distances when people are driving for work. We're talking about, these incremental differences really make an impact. And I think that having optimization software to help support operators is really, really vital and drivers to follow that. And then obviously we can ensure that they have followed the guidance, rather than just gone wherever they fancy, done whatever they want to do, stopped at home for lunch if they wanted to.
Yeah, there was no traceability and no tracking. There's just more accountability on everyone now as well. So yeah, it's an interesting, relatable point. I can definitely think of similar situations where I have 3 different ways to get to the same location. Often I just end up rotating them, because I figure that's how I'm going to get the best out of it. But you're right, there's tools with the fleets and with trucks. There's big technology exists to know what's the best route, and I think it's important that they're using it and adopting it. The last point I want to bring up here, and it's kind of two-faceted, and you touched on the maintenance aspect, and I want to leave that to last, because I think that one's a nice way to sort of bring everything full circle. The first one I wanted to bring up is this, what fleet operators should be considering when they're looking at one of the sustainable goals. Obviously, they're going to be upgrading their fleets to maybe more fuel-efficient models, or fuel alternatives, or electric, or whatever all of these different elements can be for their operations. What are things they need to consider when looking at these alternative fleet vehicles that maybe they wouldn't consider otherwise, and how does that impact the long-term savings that company can have?
Sure. So that's a really interesting point, Mark, and it's one that my answer is sort of quite considered, which is why I take a bit of a moment to have a think about it. Yeah. Now, there's lots of things to consider when you select in vehicles. There's lots of things to consider, and that is the technical use of the vehicle. Does it meet our needs? And then also, is it from a cost over time perspective? How's that going to work for us? So I had some experience with this when I worked for a vehicle manufacturer, because one of the things with alternative fuels is it can be more expensive as a capital investment. Okay, so we have a more expensive vehicle, but then we need to look at the lifetime value that vehicle will bring, and the sustainability benefit that it will bring over its lifetime. Now, I think one of the challenges I have with this whole process, and I've spoken about it before on a podcast, and that is that when you select vehicles, naturally the manufacturers themselves come into play, okay? And what happens is each of the manufacturers, particularly in the European HGV market, as an example, there's only about 7 or 8 key players. Okay, and within those 7 or 8 key players, there's probably 2 or 3 that own multiple of the other 7 or 8. So there's like this real incentive to back or sell the product that they've got, right? So one of the things that I think is really, really important from my independent perspective is to get someone wholly independent to have a look and to trial and test those different models. Now, there's a lot of data points that are going to be unknown. So, for example, we don't know how these are going to wear, or we don't know, what the maintenance cost of this is going to be and that's going to be. So those can be tricky to work out. But if we're doing a cost of investment against a fuel consumption measurement, for example, so we've got something that's going to reduce the fuel consumption, but it costs more up front, we need to do this lifetime type calculation. And I just think for my advice to fleet managers is just be really pragmatic and driven by the data, be driven by the facts that are being put in front of you rather than what potentially is the most compelling offer that you're being sold, because I think there's a intention potentially for a manufacturer to have kind of backed one thing. So they might have backed a certain type of gas vehicle, or they might have backed electric, or whatever it may be, and then the salesperson themselves is going to be incentivized by the manufacturer to then sell those vehicles. And I think never before now, historically, when everything's been diesel, we've always been comparing eggs with eggs, or apples with apples is a term we use in the UK, right? So we're like comparing one thing with another thing. But if we're comparing a gas truck with an electric truck or another alternative fuel or whatever it may be,
totally different.
You've really got to look at the data. You've got to look at lots of different information points to be able to decide what the right option is for you. And I probably make that sound scarier than it is. I don't mean it to sound that way, because it is a scary time when you're doing like fleet selection and stuff and thinking, it's like that old thing of like IBM used to use of no one used to get sacked for buying an IBM or whatever the saying was, I think. And Apple have always come in and then tried to disrupt that, for example, and obviously they've done an amazing job. And like sometimes the thing is like you think, well, I'm a fleet manager, I've got to make this decision, but I don't want to upset my bosses by making the wrong decision. I'm just going to make the safe bet of going for what I've always gone for, because it's safe and I'm not going to get sacked. And actually, that might not be the best option either. It might be, there's so much to choose from now. There's so many different factors. I think you've got to take a really pragmatic view. In my opinion, if you're buying in bulk, I would probably get someone independent to review or peer review that choice, that process that you're going through as to how you select it and the impact it's going to have. There are people out there who are independent and can help calculate emissions, they can help calculate the sustainability, they can help calculate all those impacts for you and help support you. I wouldn't rely on the person who's trying to make that sale to provide you that information.
I was going to ask, and I think you just changed kind of the way I was going to ask the question, because maybe it's not as easy as I was hoping to make it. I was going to ask, based on your expertise on the industry, you have years working in it, different aspects of it, is there a top choice when we look at these alternative fuel or different types of fleets? That I was going to ask that, but it sounds like getting this independent review, maybe each situation is different. So for each fleet operator, there's a different best answer. Is that more the case?
Yeah. So that actually, Mark, you sort of predicted that's the right answer for me. And the reason for that one, so the way I can best answer that is it's the reason that I love the industry so much, right? Because I work with, on the one hand, a skip operator who collects waste and recycling in skips. They transport it short distances from one place to another, and then they unload that waste and then they go and serve someone else. And then I work with a removals firm, so they might go locally and they're running these fleet of vehicles and they're moving people from house to house, and sometimes they're going short, sometimes they're going long distances. And then I also will help a builder's merchant. The builder's merchant locally, they've got to get these building products from here to a site safely, and that might not be going in any more of a 30-mile radius. And then I've got guys who are like in the UK, they're going from London to Scotland tomorrow, and it's like, that's one of the beauties for me of our industry, is it's so varied, and there's so many different types of vehicles, and there's so many different types of operations. And my answer is that for some operations, electric's going to be best. For some operations, gas is going to be best. It really does depend on the operation you're doing, and that is also why I answered about having to be really pragmatic. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and go electric's the future, or gas is the future, or diesel's the future, or whatever it may be, because I think definitely start to look at these alternative fuels, because you've kind of got to. And one of the things that Flagship do with our clients is we help them with standards, like operational standards, and all of those standards now, which a lot of these operators have to gain their contracts. It's all asking them, what's your sustainability plan? What is your plan? What are you doing about it? How are you going to renew your fleet of vehicles? How are you making accountancies for this? And it's something you need to start looking at now, for sure.
Yeah, again, I was maybe a bit hopeful for the sound bite of, electric is the future, or hydrogen fuel cells is the future, but it is exactly like you said. Every case is going to be different. It really highlights the importance to have that independent review. But I think the message here, and I think you would agree, is you have to take there has to be some sustainable step, no matter what that is.
Sure, yeah. And don't get me wrong, hydrogen is really exciting, right? I was looking, JCB, I was at a seminar a year or so ago, and JCB were there presenting. They're doing some loads of really cool work with this. In the UK, it's not sustainable yet, because you can't buy the fuel. You can't buy the hydrogen quickly enough or cost effectively enough to be able to make it happen. But and that's the other point, isn't it? Is like your decision today versus your decision tomorrow or in a year's time.
It's changing so fast.
Yeah,
infrastructure.
Exactly that. You've kind of just got to make the best decision you can make today.
Which again really comes back to falling back on those maybe independent assistant companies that can give you that, maybe have a bit more of an outlook than you would have. Really
exactly that. Yeah.
So the last point, obviously we touched on it, we alluded to it. I want to touch on the maintenance topic, because I think maintenance has obviously a substantial impact on the sustainability of a fleet of vehicles, especially when we scale it up to what we've said, all those millions of miles and kilometers, and dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of trucks. I guess starting at the top of it then, how can regular maintenance of a vehicle, of a fleet vehicle, optimize the sustainability of that fleet?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a big advocate for preventative maintenance.
Love it.
And effectively looking after any piece of equipment or any piece of machinery, because it affects the longevity. And it's very similar. Mark, you look like a fit guy. I can tell you work out. Look at you. Like,
I'm in this chair. I just fit.
Yeah. No, it's cool, right? So, and I enjoy working out too, right? So we're human beings. We like to go and exercise. And what we do is we hope that we do this preventative maintenance by eating a good diet, healthy diet, exercising regularly, keeping our body moving, those kinds of things. That sets us up for a sustainable long-term life, right? It's good for us long-term. It gives us more energy. And machinery and vehicles are no different, right? So if we make sure that we, it's just the right thing to do. And from a sustainability perspective, if we are properly, even down to the small stuff, right? The wear and tear on a tyre. So let's just take that black rubber basic piece of thing that keeps you safe on the road. Right? Yeah. There's so many options out there, right? Do I go for, what brand do I go for? They're all different types of rubber. But the key thing is like, let's make sure they're properly inflated. I could go now, genuinely, I could go out, I'm literally on site with an operator right now, and I can go outside and I can check 30 vehicles, and they'll all have varying levels of air in their tyres, right? And all of those tyres will then be wearing inconsistently and differently and those kinds of things. So just making sure that the air in the tyres are consistent, making sure that, particularly with the new Euro 6 diesel engines, making sure those exhaust systems are properly maintained, that we're replacing the parts when they're needed, that we're carrying out the regenerations, all of those kinds of things helps prevent further problems down the line. If we know that, a certain nozzle gets bunged up at a certain period of time, just replace it beforehand. If a filter needs replacing, let's get the filter replaced early, or I'm not saying too early, but making sure that we properly calculate it. One of the things that I used to do, again, when I worked for a vehicle manufacturer, is we'd actually calculate. So in the UK, we inspect trucks, for example, every 6 weeks, usually most vehicles every 6 weeks. And one of the things that we do, which is very painful for an operator, is to bring that vehicle in because the brake pads need replacing, for example. So one of the things we'd do is we'd calculate, we'd look at the previous inspections and we'd calculate where the depth is of that brake pad, and we'll go, is it going to make the next 6 weeks or is it not? And if it's not going to make the 6 weeks, let's just do it now, because then it's not having to come in between. And just being really calculated and thoughtful about the way we maintain our vehicles is so important for their longevity. Obviously the way they're driven is important too, but the way we maintain stuff is really, really important to reduce consumption. And we reduce the consumption on a local level, and if we do it really well, if everyone just started to improve by 5 or 10% on their consumption of parts and vehicle maintenance and those kinds of things by being preventative, and because the other thing particularly, I guess with trucks, for example, is if it's recommended to me that I replace, like, I don't know, let's replace like a turbo or something, and the manufacturer recommends that I do it at, say, 500,000 kilometres, and I don't listen to them, and then it blows, and then all of a sudden, you've got all these other issues of additional pieces and parts that have gone wrong off the back of that problem. Then that creates another issue. So definitely maintaining vehicles preventatively in advance, based on the data, is definitely a smart option and more sustainable. Mark, have I got a bit passionate there? Sorry.
No, but it's a super important topic, and you could literally have an entire conversation just around the maintenance aspect, and maybe we will down the line. But you said something at the end there that I would just like to touch on again and maybe get a bit further dive into it. It kind of loops back to that talk about technology a little bit. Based on the data, maintenance based on the data. Can you just elaborate a bit more on how fleets are maybe doing it now, ways they could be doing it better, managing this preventative maintenance based on the data that they're receiving from vehicles, from the fleets, from the drivers?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I think is really important for a fleet is that they maintain good relationships with the vehicle manufacturer, because then they get the updates around certain elements and parts. But what I mean is that if we keep good data around maintenance of vehicles over time, so for example, we know based on historic data points that at a certain point this part will need replacing or that part will need replacing or those kinds of things, it's good to keep those bits of data as to when that happens, because we can start to implement that through the fleet to keep them running all the time, to keep them efficient, keep them working effectively, those kinds of things. Because if we leave that to chance, it creates issues, breakdowns. And like I said, particularly with vehicles, if that item fails, then often it can take other items with it, and then you're having to, it costs more long term rather than just replacing the thing, right? It can create more problems.
Yeah, you mentioned tires earlier on. I think that's something to mention there. With you leave a tire unchecked, you're not checking the tread regularly, you're uninflating it properly, you're having uneven wear on that tire. If it's not brought in a preventative way, or not tracking that data in a preventative way, a tire blows on the highway. These are not small pieces of rubber. These are sometimes the size of small cars. The damage they can cause to that vehicle, to other vehicles, the downtime of that vehicle, the potential legal issues. It just really highlights. I like that example a lot because it has such a profound impact on so many things around the vehicle and the fleet, that if you're not managing it preventatively and you're not tracking this information and really looking at the data, your costs are going to be through the roof. Eventually, it's going to happen, right?
Yeah, and tires are the same. So there's so much good practice I can raise really. Like, so tires are so important to fuel consumption, for example. Really, really important to fuel consumption that they're properly inflated. But the next example, the really simple examples like brake pads. If I don't replace my brake pads quickly enough, they're going to wear through the discs because they're just going to start grinding against the discs. So again, they're going to be replacing brake discs. There's all kinds of challenges that then raises. Another really good example is that people who do so one of the things that I used to see really commonly is that vehicles would go onto building sites and into quarries and those kinds of things, and what happens then is they get covered in dirt, okay, and then the issue with that is you get all this wet muck all over the vehicles all the time. So just by the simple process of keeping that vehicle clean, you're reducing the likelihood of electrical issues with wiring looms and things like that. You're, certainly the stuff that vehicles pick up off building sites and those kinds of things, they can start to wear through metal components like the brake calipers and things like that. So just by really good practice of just like washing off on a daily basis, for example, obviously it's good for the brand, it's good for the brand image because you've got nice clean vehicles, but also just like taking those simple approaches to going, we're going to clean the vehicles, we're going to keep them nice, because it's always a surefire thing. It's going to be the dirtiest vehicle that's got loads of, has all corroded wiring and loom issues and ABS faults and this and that and what have you, because it's not been maintained properly. So
it's a really nice one. That's a really nice one that maybe I wouldn't have thought of, and it makes perfect sense. Of course, a car that's, especially in those winter months, even on the regular roads with the gravel and the salt and all the dirt on the roads, let alone the construction sites and the big, wet, dirty areas as well. I think it just creates more issue. It's a really nice oversight. Good. I think that's it. That's perfect. I mean, I think there's no better way to end than on that point of just that preventative topic again with that maintenance, and then just keeping a close eye on your vehicles, track it with data, use everything you can, use the tools available, have that communication with the drivers for that feedback loop to make sure you're implementing the right things. I think it's a beautiful full circle conversation. Pete, thank you so much for this. I really, really appreciated it. Before we wrap, any final notes that you feel we're missing out on, or anything that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we've covered everything we planned to today. So I'm really pleased, Mark, and I've really enjoyed chatting to you today. And I hope the audience have found it valuable and interesting. And if they have, that I'm really pleased. Absolutely, we'll definitely make sure they get all the information. But yeah, again, Pete, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate the conversation as well. Thank you, Mark. Take care. And for everyone watching and listening to this episode of the Auto Tech Show, thank you so much for being with us. It's been great having you. Lots of insights and some maybe not so common topics that we touched on today when it comes to this sustainability topic with fleets and hitting those goals from a lot of different aspects. So if you have any questions about what you heard today, or you want to add to a conversation, head down to the podcast notes below. You'll see links there for Pete's various businesses and his podcast. You can check out those. I highly recommend to check out Fleet Geeks. It's a great show. And we'll also put LinkedIn links there for myself and for Pete. If you do have questions about what you heard and you want to reach out, please do. You never know what that'll spark, a future conversation as well, a future show. But lots to digest, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it, as Pete mentioned there. So with that, we'll leave everyone to have a fantastic rest of your day wherever in the world you may be. And we'll see you on a new episode of the Auto Tech Show very soon. Bye for now.